Grüß Domini and Verlegens video. Welcome to yet another exciting video, in this case part 24 of my Battles series of videos. This video series will cover the Polish campaign between the 1st of September and the 6th of October 1939, with this specific video covering the period in between World War I and World War II. For native Polish speakers, my profound apologies if I incorrectly pronounce any Polish words, which I'm certain I shall. For many people, World War II holds a strange fascination as well as horror in some ways. If people themselves were not directly affected, they would have been indirectly affected by their parents. Yet, for many people, World War II started with the German invasion of France, or Russia, or the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. The early events, which had an indirect effect, such as the Japanese invasion of China, or the German takeover of Austria or Czechoslovakia, or events which had a direct effect on the war, most notably the invasion of Poland, are often ignored or downplayed. The 1st of September 1939 represents the beginning, or official beginning, of the conflict called the Second World War. Yet even for those people, the actual campaign is no more than a minor precursor to the real thing. This video is an attempt to correct that view and to show people that the German invasion of Poland represented something far more than just a minor event on the road to global war. The lessons learnt by the Germans in Poland allowed them to fine-tune and perfect their mobile war doctrine, called in the West Blitzkrieg and possibly in German Bewegungskrieg, and corrected major problems with the then hastily organised Wehrmacht. Consequently, these lessons, which were not learnt by the French and British, contributed to their humiliating defeats the following year. The West had 8 months to study the results of the Polish campaign and learn from them. They certainly did to a lesser extent with the hasty formation of armoured and mechanised divisions, but so much war could have been done, which was not. But for even those of us which do study the Polish campaign and wonder about the opportunity gains and losses, normally forgets one of the most important aspects of the campaign, the Polish nation and the people themselves. Study after study looks at the German side, the preparation, the planning, the lessons they learned and the gains they achieved. The Polish side is normally only given a brief summary with little background history. Therefore, we can look at the Polish deployment and ponder the military foolishness of this without really understanding the reasons for this deployment. This is the final reason for this video, to look at the campaign from the Polish side and try and understand the whys of this significant campaign. This can allow us to look at the great pastime of all historians, the what-ifs. What if Poland did this or that? What could the results be? So if this is the kind of history you like, carry on. The tragedy of Poland was more than anything caused by its position. Surrounded by larger powers, it could always find itself, or always found itself, in an impossible strategic position. In 1772, a large portion of Poland was partitioned equally between Prussia, Russia and Austria. In 1793, Russia greatly increased its share of this poor nation, and in 1794, the remainder of Poland went again to Russia, Prussia and Austria. Apart from Napoleon's Grand Duchy of Warsaw, Poland remained firmly under the control of 3 major powers in this region. The only time this control was tested was during the 2 revolts against Russia, which occurred in 1830 and 1863. In both cases, the major nations put aside any disagreements between themselves and helped to ensure Polish nationalism was to be firmly crushed. This gentleman's agreement between Russia, Prussia and Austria was to fall apart by 1914 due to the Great War. The first signs of the re-establishment of Poland occurred in August 1914 when the Tsar promised autonomy to the Poles. No doubt the Russians wanted to create a secure rear in their battles with the Central Powers. Russia-occupied Poland proved an essential strategic hub in Russia's war with both Germany and Austria. If the Central Powers decided to use Polish nationalism to promote a revolt, it may well have been disastrous. As it was, Germany and Austria was initially not interested in stirring up Polish nationalism. In 1916, the Central Powers proclaimed the Congress Poland, including all Polish territory except Poznan and Galicia. This was an attempt by the Central Powers to weaken Russia by promoting revolution and the formation of buffer states between it and Russia. In the newly formed Council of State, the father of modern Poland, Józef Piłsudski, received a seat. However, Pilsudski became disillusioned with this attempt to provide greater autonomy to Poland, and he resigned on the 2nd of July 1917. The Germans arrested Pilsudski in Magdeburg soon after, and he was detained until November 1918. The Allies also decided to use Polish nationalism for their own aims. With the surrender of Russia, there was no reason why they should not. In August 1917, the Polish National Committee was formed in Paris. Roman Dmowski, 1864 to 1939, who was a member of the Polish National Democratic Movement, chaired this committee. This group was vital in getting needed Allied support for the formation of independent Poland, although it was later a cause of friction in Poland due to its democratic tendencies. With the seeming failure of the Congress of Poland, Germany established a Council of Regency, which provided the Poles greater autonomy and its own government, but it was subject to Germany. The Germans performed this in the Baltic states and was aimed at ensuring there were friendly nations acting as a buffer between it and Russia. The Germans used the imprisoned Pilsudski as the chairman of the Council of Regency. The final nail in the coffin of the Council of Regency was the defeat of the Central Powers. It was at this point the Poles decided to take things into their own hands. On November the 9th, 1918, Poland declared its independence, and on the 10th of November, the same year, Józef Pilsudski returned from exile and assumed supreme power as head of state. On the 22nd of January 1919, Paderewski coalition cabinet gained power in the Sejm, which is the parliament, under Pilsudski as head of state. Now Poland was a state in name only, with none of its borders finalised. German troops still on Polish soil, and Bolshevik troops always a threat to the east. In order to stabilise the state and make Poland a true state, an army of 600,000 men were formed in late January, and coupled with massive US aid, the Poles began to make the state of Poland a reality. In the West, the Allies at the Versailles Conference decided upon the borders. A special plebiscite was called in East Prussia and Silesia, but after the vote was taken, they remained German, although the Poles did try and unofficially keep them. The Germans, after a short period of low-intensity warfare, managed to clear them out of their own territories. Poland was also involved in many low-key conflicts with unofficial German militias. The Germans simply did not want to give up all their territories and attempted to keep them using a guerrilla-style combat. The Polish army managed to remove these from their territories and secured their borders. On the Czech border, the boundaries were finalised by 1920 by the Allies. However, Poland was annoyed that over 100,000 Poles remained in Czechoslovakia. In the east, the situation was far more confusing, as the West had far smaller influence. The Russian Civil War and various ethnic and nationalistic issues caused a multitude of low-intensity fighting to break out, but the major conflict was with Russia. The Russian border was only finalised after 2 years of hard fighting. Pilsudski had visions of forming a grand Polish-Ukrainian confederation, and he made an agreement with the Ukrainian national leader, Szymon Petlura, signing a military convention on the 22nd of April 1920. Pilsudski hoped to get a Ukrainian division to help in his invasion, but was only provided with a Ukrainian infantry battalion and a cavalry regiment. Nonetheless, with this agreement and alliance, he launched an invasion of the Ukraine on the 24th of April 1920. The invasion was a great success, with Polish formations advancing 88 kilometres on the first day alone. The Russians had placed the bulk of their army north of the Pripyat marshes, so the forces opposing the Poles were outnumbered and suffered heavy casualties. Unlike the fighting during 1918 and 1919, which was disorganised and consisted of poorly equipped and organised men, the Polish invasion of 1920 was a well-organised and supported operation. Using a great deal of captured Central Power equipment and aid from the West, the Polish army conducted an early form of mobile mechanised warfare. Polish aircraft bombed Kiev and located Russian troops. Polish armoured cars led the advance towards Kiev, and Polish tanks acted as useful reserves. On May the 7th, 1920, Kiev was taken, and the Polish army swung north. The Poles began to equip Ukrainian formations and hoped to create a useful Allied army by the end of May. The Poles seemed to have achieved their objectives. However, on the 5th of June, the Russians struck with their Konin army, a 16,000-man Cossack army. Breaking through the Polish lines at Zhytomyr, the Russians forced a rapid retreat of the Polish army. By June 8, 1920, the Poles began to withdraw before the Bolshevik armies at an average rate of 40 kilometers per day. The Ukrainian army collapsed before the onslaught of the Cossacks, and soon the Poles were left alone, using their tanks and aircraft to cover the retreat of their army. As the Russians were reaching the Polish border, the Poles raised new division in any way they could, recruiting poets, priests and old men. But still the Russians advanced, crossing the Niemen River on the 20th July and the Bug on the 1st of August. By the beginning of August, the Bolsheviks were approaching Warsaw. The Russians hoped to capture Warsaw on the 12th of August, but a final massive effort from the Polish side first slowed and then stopped the Russian invasion. The Allies were not too happy about a possible Bolshevik victory, and the French sent massive military aid to Poland, while the British sent food and money. The supply of food allowed Poland to recruit almost every available man, even from the farms, and the military equipment allowed these troops to be armed. With these new formations and equipment, Puzinski launched a counterattack south of Warsaw on the 15th of August 1920 and broke through on the 16th of August 1920. In the next few days, Puzinski won a resounding victory against the exhausted Bolshevik army and forced them back. The dreaded Autonomy was shattered on the 31st of August, and the rest of the Russians began their retreat. The Polish advance did not resemble the previous rapid advance by both nations. Instead, the poor weather allowed the Russians to slowly withdraw. The exhausted state of the Polish army and the severely stretched Polish supply lines would have helped to keep the Polish advance in check. The Polish army took Minsk on the 22nd of September 1920, and the reformed Ukrainian army crossed the Dniester on the 15th of September 1920. To avoid any further reversal, Puzinski agreed to a truce on the 12th of October, and on March 18th, 1921, the Treaty of Riga was signed, which formalised the eastern borders. The Polish conflict were at end, at least until 1939. The last Polish act was the taking of Vilna. The Russians controlled Vilna when the Polish forces drove east. Lithuania wanted Vilna as its capital, but Poland was unwilling to let it go. Therefore, a staged act of revolt, Poland occupied Vilna on October the 9th, 1920. The city was historically Lithuania, but ethnically Polish, so the plebiscite voted to stay with Poland. The fact Puzinski was born in the region may have had an influence, as Puzinski insisted the city remained in Polish hands. This state of affairs was finalised by the Allies 2 years later. After the victory against the Russian, Puzinski remained as head of state until 1922 and head of the army until 1923, after which he retired for 3 further years. During his 5-year period, the Polish government had to struggle with a host of internal difficulties, both political and national. Puzinski was supported by the Legionnaires, and opposing this political force was the National Democrats. The election of 1922 saw the National Democrats win the vote, which caused Puzinski to resign. Narutowicz replaced him, who was assassinated soon after by elements loyal to Puzinski. A socialist, Stanislav Wojciechowski, who was head of state until 1926, replaced Narutowicz. The period between 1922 and 1926 was one of great political instability, with all the major parties of the Sejm fighting each other constantly. This resulted in the government not having the power required to resolve the other more serious problems facing Poland, nationalism and the rebuilding of the economy. Poland in 1922 consisted of several racial minorities. There were 100,000 Lithuanians, 1 million Germans, 1.5 million White Russians, 3 million Jews, and 4 million Ukrainians. The Poles never satisfactorily resolved the nationality issue and in the end had to resort to force. This was especially evident in December 1925, when the Land Reform Bill expropriated above all German landowners, while the Polish landowners were treated with a great deal of consideration. This annoyed the Germans as they felt they were being discriminated against, and annoyed the other nationalities as they desired land which the large Polish landowners held onto. The only racial group satisfied were the Polish. This caused a mini-civil war, with the government locked in bitter disagreement and the countryside up in arms. Disgusted with this state of affairs, Puzinski returned to politics and with the aid of the legionnaires he seized power on May the 12th, 1926. Pilsudski seized power by means of a military coup d'etat and began the job of dismantling democracy within Poland. The president, Stanisław Wojciechowski, resigned. Pilsudski then ensured his man, Ignace Mazkieti, was appointed president. Until his death on May the 12th, 1935, Pilsudski held the real reins of power in Poland. Pilsudski served as Prime Minister, Minister of Defence and Chief of the General Staff from August 1926 to November 1928, with the help of the army, his supporters and the bureaucracy. In 1930, another election was held, returning the government. The election was anything but fair and open and was a further step in the consolidation of the pseudo-dictatorship. In 1935, Pilsudski introduced a guided democracy which put an end to parliamentary democracy, securing the ruling clique of the colonels. Pilsudski died soon after and Ignace Mazkieti became president. In April 22, 1936, a new constitution was created which gave the president far more power. However, the death of Pilsudski actually weakened the government. Internal dissent was on the upswing, against which Ignace Mazkieti was forced to use more and more brutal means to suppress. He was required to suppress the minorities and also suppress the democratic movement. In 1937, Colonel Koch formed the Camp of National Unity, which was intended to strengthen a sense of national unity. It was loosely modelled on Italian fascism, which had a major focus on nationalism. It should be noted the Italian fascism I mention here was modelled on the original ancient Roman concept of united we stand, divided we fall, rather than the rather flexible definition of fascism we use today. Considering Poland was surrounded by extremely hostile major powers in 1937, this was possibly understandable. However, this attempt did not impress the Democrats or Socialists, who continued the struggle against the current dictatorship. This state of affair affected the Polish war effort, as until 1938 the Polish government was more interested in internal struggles than what was occurring in Germany. The period of 1936 to 1938 was one of general military decline in Poland. Previously, Pilsudski always ensured that military preparedness was a high government policy, as he knew well that hostile and very large neighbours surrounded Poland. This was forgotten during the 1936 and 1938 period, as the then leader Ignace Mazkieti was more interested in shoring up his power. No history of Poland is complete without first talking about Józef Pilsudski, the father of modern Poland. More than any single man, he was responsible for the formation of Poland and acted as its rallying point and symbol. Józef Pilsudski was born near Vilna, which was then in Russian Poland. At the University of Krakow, he began to read subversive literature, and in 1887 was arrested for socialist agitation and sent to Siberia for 5 years. In 1894, he became editor of the clandestine Polish socialist newspaper Robotnik, in which he put forward strongly nationalistic views. In 1904, he went to Tokyo to try and enlist Japanese help for the Polish revolt during the Russian-Japanese War. In 1914, the Austrian government authorised him to lead a Polish legion against the Russians, and he recruited a force of 10,000 men. In 1917, the Germans, who distrusted Austrian patronage of the Polish cause, interned Pilsudski. On his release, he went straight to Warsaw, where the acting government gave him command of all Polish armies and made him provisional head of state. He led the Polish army against the Russians in 1919-20, remained the dominant figure in Poland until the end of 1921, and continued as head of state until May 1923. He retired from political life for 3 years, but exasperated by the instability of the democratic governments, he staged a military coup in May 1926, and from that day until his death 9 years later, was effectively dictator of Poland in all but name, acting as Prime Minister from 1926 to 1928 and for a brief period in 1930, and remaining Minister for War throughout the entire period. He was one of the first political leaders to perceive the danger to Europe of a Nazi Germany. After vainly seeking to arouse his French ally, he authorised the conclusion of a non-aggression pact with Germany in 1934. And so we come to an end of my part 25 of my military history video, in this case the first video in a series of videos of the Polish campaign in 1939. In this video we have covered the period in between the war. I'll continue this series in my next video. Alle guten Dinge, kommen zu einem Ende.